Dr. Richard Porter's face drained of color as he flipped through the folder I placed in front of him. His manicured fingers trembled slightly, disturbing the careful arrangement of luxury pens on his desk. "This can't be right," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "There must be some mistake." "I ran the tests myself," I replied calmly. "Twice. No mistake, Richard. Stage 3 pancreatic adenocarcinoma with vascular involvement." Porter looked up, really seeing me for the first time since I'd entered his office. "Dr. Hayes," he said, attempting to regain his composure. "I wasn't aware you were handling my case personally. I wasn't supposed to be, I admitted, but when I saw your name on the patient roster, I felt it was appropriate." The irony wasn't lost on either of us. 3 years ago, Richard Porter had stood in this same office, though I had been on the other side of the desk then, and explained with practiced sympathy why Cedars Memorial Hospital couldn't approve my wife's experimental treatment. Insurance limitations, budget constraints, protocol restrictions. His words had been a death sentence delivered with corporate politeness. "My name is Dr. Michael Hayes. At 45, I had spent my career in oncology research until my wife Sarah's diagnosis with an aggressive form of leukemia had pulled me back into clinical practice. After her death, I had thrown myself into my work, eventually becoming one of the country's leading specialists in difficult-to-treat cancers. 6 months ago, I had accepted the position of Chief of Oncology at Cedars Memorial, the same hospital where Sarah had died, the same hospital still run by the man who had denied her last chance at survival. Some called it masochism. Others suspected revenge. I preferred to think of it as unfinished business. "Well," Porter said, closing the file with forced casualness, "I appreciate your thoroughness, but I'll be transferring my care to Memorial Sloan Kettering. I have colleagues there who specialize in pancreatic cancer." Of course, I nodded. "That's your right. Though I should mention that Dr. Abrams at Sloan Kettering was my mentor. We consult on cases weekly, and he's currently on sabbatical in Switzerland." Porter's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Johns Hopkins, then." "Dr. Chen. We co-authored the most recent paper on the experimental protocol you'd need. She'd just refer you back to me." A flash of understanding crossed Porter's face. "You've been planning this?" he accused, a hint of fear breaking through his corporate veneer. "You took this position knowing that eventually every powerful man faces his mortality?" I finished for him. "No, but I did take this position knowing that I could prevent what happened to Sarah from happening to others." Porter stood abruptly, buttoning his bespoke suit jacket. "This is unprofessional. I'll speak with the board about your conduct." "By all means," I gestured toward his phone. "Though you might want to read page 7 of your file first, the section on treatment options." His hand hesitated over the phone. Curiosity or fear won out. He reopened the file, turning to the page I'd indicated. "As you can see," I explained as he read, "standard protocols for your specific case have a 17% 5-year survival rate. Not particularly encouraging." Porter's face had gone ashen. "And this experimental approach?" he asked, pointing to the second option. 83% in initial trials, I said. "It's the same treatment protocol Sarah needed. The one you denied as too experimental and not cost-effective." The silence in the room was thick enough to cut with a scalpel. "If this is some twisted form of revenge," Porter began. "Revenge will be denying you treatment," I interrupted, my voice level. "Revenge will be watching you navigate the same bureaucratic nightmare you've created for thousands of patients. Revenge will be easy, Richard." I stood straightening my white coat. "But I took an oath, the same one you took before you decided hospital administration was more lucrative than actually treating patients. First, do no harm." Porter sank back into his chair, the reality of his situation finally hitting him. The great equalizer, disease, had brought one of Philadelphia's most powerful healthcare executives to the same vulnerable position as the patients whose care he reduced to numbers on spreadsheets. "What do you want from me?" he asked quietly. "Reform," I replied simply, "beginning with approval of the Compassionate Care Initiative I submitted to the board last month, the one you've been blocking, full funding for our clinical trials program, and your public support for the policy changes that would prevent insurance denials for experimental treatments when standard options fail." "You're blackmailing me." I shook my head. "I'm offering you the best medical care available, regardless of costs, exactly what I'd offer any patient. The policy changes aren't for my benefit. They're for the patients who will come after you. I placed a second folder on his desk. This contains the consent forms for treatment, along with the policy amendments I've drafted for the board. Take the weekend to review everything. My team begins the first treatment cycle on Monday morning. As I turned to leave, Porter called after me. Hayes, I paused at the door. If I refuse? I looked back at him, allowing myself a small, sad smile. Then you'll receive the current standard of care for someone with your diagnosis and insurance limitations. Nothing more, nothing less. Exactly what Sarah received. The executive wing of Cedars Memorial Hospital had always seemed like a separate universe from the medical floors. All mahogany paneling and tasteful artwork, designed to impress donors and comfort board members who rarely ventured into the actual hospital corridors. Dr. Elena Patel, my deputy and longtime friend, waited for me by the elevator. Well, she asked as the doors closed. He'll agree, I replied, the confidence in my voice masking the turmoil beneath. Self-preservation is a powerful motivator. Elena studied my face. Are you sure you can do this, Michael? Treat the man well. Yes, I said firmly. I have to. When Sarah had been diagnosed 3 years ago, I had still been primarily a research oncologist, working on experimental protocols that showed promise for treatment-resistant cancers. Her leukemia had initially responded to conventional approaches, but when it returned aggressively, the only hope had been an immunotherapy trial I'd helped develop. Porter, recently appointed as CEO, had been implementing a new fiscal responsibility framework. Sarah's treatment had become a casualty of his policies, deemed too expensive, too experimental for the hospital to justify to their insurance partners. By the time I had arranged alternative options at another institution, her condition had deteriorated beyond the point of eligibility. I had watched my brilliant, vibrant wife slip away over 6 agonizing weeks. Porter had sent flowers to her funeral, hospital policy for employees' family members. The board meeting is Wednesday, Elena reminded me as we exited onto the oncology floor. A world of beeping monitors, hushed conversations, and the distinct antiseptic smell that no amount of air freshener could disguise. If Porter supports the initiative, we could change everything. When he supports it, I corrected. He doesn't have a choice. Monday morning arrived with the controlled chaos typical of a hospital beginning its week. I had been at Cedars since 5 a.m., reviewing cases and preparing for Porter's treatment. When he arrived, escorted by a private nurse, his typical commanding presence had already diminished, whether from the reality of his diagnosis or the knowledge of his precarious position with me, I couldn't tell. Dr. Hayes, he acknowledged stiffly. Richard, I replied, using his first name deliberately. I see you've met Nurse Okafor. She'll be your primary during treatment. I've brought the signed paperwork, he said, handing me both folders. All of it. I reviewed the documents quickly, consent for treatment, and more importantly, his written endorsement of the policy changes I proposed, ready for Wednesday's board meeting. Excellent, I said, handing the policy documents to Elena. Let's get you settled and begin the protocol. Over the next hour, Porter experienced the reality most patients face, changing into a hospital gown, surrendering his autonomy to medical staff, becoming a body to be treated rather than a person in control. I explained each step of the protocol in detail, watching as he processed the information not as a hospital administrator but as a frightened patient. This is the same treatment Sarah needed, he asked as Nurse Okafor inserted his IV line. A refined version, I answered. We've improved the response rate since then. His eyes met mine. Would it have saved her? The question hung in the air between us. 3 years of grief, anger, and professional determination compressed into 6 words. Probably, I said finally. We'll never know. The first round of treatment proceeded smoothly. Porter tolerated the initial medications well, and the specialized immunotherapy components were scheduled for day 3. As we concluded, I updated his chart while Elena checked his vital signs. The board chairman called. Elena informed me quietly as Porter dozed. He's confirmed the special session for Wednesday to review the policy changes. Good, I nodded. Everything's proceeding as planned. What I didn't tell Elena was how seeing Porter as a patient, vulnerable, afraid, clutching at hope the same way Sarah had, was affecting me. I had anticipated satisfaction, perhaps even a grim sense of justice. Instead, I felt a complex mixture of emotions that didn't fit neatly into categories like revenge or redemption. Wednesday morning found me standing before the hospital board, Porter seated among them, looking noticeably more haggard than his usual polished self. The effects of Sunday and Monday's treatments were evident in his pallor and a slight tremor in his hands. The Compassionate Care Initiative, I began, represents a fundamental shift in how Cedars Memorial approaches cases that fall outside standard treatment protocols. Rather than defaulting to denial based on cost considerations, we propose a multidisciplinary review process that prioritizes patient outcomes over short-term financial metrics. Several board members shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. This philosophy directly contradicted the approach Porter had championed for years. The data is clear. I continued displaying slides that showed both medical outcomes and long-term financial implications. When we invest in innovative treatments, even expensive ones, we not only save lives but ultimately reduce costs through shorter hospital stays, fewer complications, and enhanced institutional reputation. I outlined the specific policy changes, the funding mechanisms, and the oversight committee structure that would ensure responsible implementation. Then, with perfect theatrical timing, I turned to Porter. CDO Porter has reviewed these proposals in detail and has prepared remarks on their financial viability. All eyes turned to him. This was the moment. Would he honor our agreement or attempt to undermine the initiative he had opposed for so long? Porter rose slowly, the effort clearly taxing him. 3 days ago, he began, his voice less commanding than usual. I received a diagnosis that many would consider a death sentence. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Few had known of his condition. Dr. Hayes is treating me with an experimental protocol, one that would have been denied under our current policies. He paused, gathering himself. The same type of protocol that was denied to his wife under my leadership. The room fell silent. I have spent my career focused on fiscal discipline and operational efficiency, Porter continued. Those aren't inherently wrong goals, but they're incomplete. Somewhere along the way, I lost sight of why we're here, not to manage a profitable business, but to save lives. He detailed his support for my initiative, emphasizing both its humanitarian and long-term financial benefits. By the time he finished speaking, several board members were nodding in agreement. The vote was unanimous. After the meeting, Porter approached me in the hallway. The board members had treated him with that peculiar combination of deference and pity reserved for the powerful when they fall ill. Their voices a little too loud, their encouragement a little too emphatic. That went well, he said, attempting his usual authoritative tone but failing to mask his exhaustion. It did, I agreed. Your support was convincing. He studied me for a moment. You know, when I realized what you were doing, positioning yourself to control my treatment, I thought it was about revenge, making me suffer the way your wife did. That would have been easier, I admitted. Then why this approach? Why help change the system rather than just punishing me? I considered the question carefully. Sarah was a structural engineer, I said finally. She used to tell me that when a building fails, you can patch the visible damage, but unless you fix the fundamental flaws in the framework, it will eventually collapse again. Porter nodded slowly, and I was a fundamental flaw. Your policies were, I corrected. You were just a symptom of a larger problem. A healthcare system that values balance sheets over human lives. We stood in silence for a moment, the hospital continuing its relentless rhythm around us. Your next treatment is tomorrow morning, I said, turning to leave. Get some rest, Richard. The protocol is demanding, but the results are worth it. Hayes, he called after me. Would you have treated me even if I hadn't agreed to support your initiative? I paused, considering the question that had haunted me since discovering his diagnosis. The answer mattered, not just to Porter, but to my own understanding of who I had become in the aftermath of Sarah's death. Yes, I said finally, because that's the difference between us. You saw Sarah as a budget item. I see you as a patient. 6 months later, Richard Porter stood at the podium in the hospital's main auditorium. Addressing the staff and media gathered for the official launch of the Cedars Memorial Compassionate Care Center, a dedicated wing for patients requiring experimental or specialized treatments regardless of insurance status. His cancer was responding well to the protocol. The latest scans showed significant tumor reduction, and while he wasn't out of danger, his prognosis had improved dramatically. He had lost weight, and his designer suits hung loosely on his frame, but his voice had regained some of its former strength. This center represents a new direction for Cedars, and we hope, for healthcare institutions nationally, he announced. Under the leadership of Dr. Michael Hayes, we have already accepted 15 patients who would previously have been denied care under our old policies. From my seat in the front row, I watched the man who had once prioritized profit margins above patient outcomes champion a system built on the opposite philosophy. Was it genuine conversion or simply self-preservation? Perhaps a bit of both. After the ceremony, as staff and board members mingled over catered refreshments, Porter approached me with 2 flutes of champagne. Sparkling cider, he clarified, handing me one. My oncologist has strong opinions about alcohol during treatment. I accepted the glass with a small smile. Your oncologist sounds wise. Occasionally insufferable, but yes, wise. He gestured toward the plaque outside the new center. The board wanted to name it after me, the Porter Center for Compassionate Care. I suggested an alternative. I followed his gaze to the engraved nameplate, the Sarah Hayes Center for Compassionate Care. I hope that's acceptable, he said, watching my reaction carefully. The gesture caught me off guard. In all the scenarios I had imagined when I'd taken this position, all the ways I had thought this story might end, this hadn't been among them. Sarah would have appreciated the irony, I said finally, raising my glass slightly, to unintended legacies. Porter nodded, clinking his glass against mine, and to second chances, medical and otherwise. Later that evening, I sat alone in my office, looking at Sarah's photograph on my desk. The grief remained a permanent fixture in my life, but it had changed shape over time, less raw, more purposeful. When I had accepted the position at Cedars, many of my colleagues had assumed I was seeking revenge against Porter and the system that had failed my wife. Perhaps that had been part of it, but Sarah had always believed in fixing broken things rather than simply assigning blame to their failure. The center bears the name of 800 of patients who would otherwise fall to the cracks of our toxic healthcare system. Patients who, like Porter, could receive care based on medical needs rather than financial calculations. It wasn't justice, nothing could truly balance the scales after Sarah's death. But it was something better, something more enduring than revenge. It was change. I tucked Sarah's photo into my bag and turned off the office light. Tomorrow would bring new patients, new challenges, and another treatment session for Porter. The work continued, not just treating disease, but treating the flawed systems that too often determined who lived and who died. In medicine, we're taught that proper diagnosis is the essential first step in effective treatment. What I had diagnosed wasn't just Porter's cancer, but the cancer within the system itself. And sometimes, treating the disease requires starting with the most visible symptom, even when that symptom wears expensive suits and sits behind a mahogany desk.